And she's currently the research director of the Eurasia in Global Dialogue program here at the Institute in Vienna. Our second speaker, Dr. Gail Lonergan, obtained her PhD in history from Oxford University. She has published her research in various prestigious journals such as Slavic Review and Nationalities Papers. She is the author of a forthcoming book entitled The Communist Party in the Russian Civil War, A Political History. And she is a tutor in politics at Ruskin College in Oxford. What these two scholars share in common, as you've probably noticed, is the Oxford connection, obviously, but also interest in Russia. So it's not surprising that their presentation tonight will focus on this country. The presentation is entitled Religion and Revolution, Two Projects of Modernity in Early 20th Century Russia. And Dr. Antonova will begin.
Very much for the generous introduction. I hope that we share some ideas in common, not just an Oxford connection, but this will come out in the talk. What I wanted to start with is that this talk was conceived within the framework of the Eurasian Global Dialogue program. And I think it's quite in the spirit of the program, because we're going to talk about religion and revolution in dialogue, in the philosophical sense of the word. And this is why I thought that I could start with this image over here, which I think, oh, can you hear me now? Ooh. This doesn't seem to, is it okay? Oh, okay. So I thought I'll start with this image here, which I think brings the two topics together in what I think is an interesting way. So it's basically a contemporary icon which was painted by a modern Greek iconographer in Kilkis. This is in the north of Greece in 2007. And as you can see, what it shows is Lenin in the process of cutting the beard of an Orthodox saint. And what attracted my attention to this icon was, of course, that the Orthodox saint has these icons coming out of his hands and his pockets and so on. And I think it sort of brings the two topics together, and it can be seen on several levels, really, because, those of you who are interested in Russian history know that there was this notorious ban on beards by Peter the Great. And the idea was that modernization and secularization in Russia was sort of forced from the top. And this is the way that Lenin fits into this tradition. I think it's quite interesting that when this fresco was painted, there was a huge row among the Greek clergy, and actually the iconographer was forced to paint it over, so it doesn't exist anymore. I got the copy from the artist himself. And what the Greeks found very upsetting about that was that it's not part of the Orthodox Christian canon to show Lenin in a church. But I think it's a misunderstanding, because there's a long Byzantine tradition of showing iconoclasts. So I think this is one way of looking at this. Now, as you can see, what we are working on is basically the same period, the beginning of the 20th century. Gail works on the Russian Revolution and the Red Army and so on. And I work on Russian religious philosophers. And the reason that we thought that we could present our two new books on two completely different topics at first glance together is the general framework in which we see the period. Now, generally, the beginning of the 20th century, what is called the fin du siècle, or in the Russian context, the Russian Silver Age, can be seen as a period of course, a flowering of culture in different fields, music, the avant-garde. There was a Russian religious renaissance going on at the time, of course, the Russian Revolution and so on. But I think that it also makes sense, and for me it is more interesting to look at the period as the intersection at which all these movements of ideas actually meet. And what are the common questions that artists, musicians, Bolsheviks, religious thinkers, and all that share. And in many ways, these questions are what Dostoevsky called the accursed questions, the really important big ideas. So there's this way of looking at the period, but also I think that it is these questions that can be revisited in a contemporary context. And I will show why when it comes to the people I'm working on. Religious philosophers from the beginning of the 20th century, which I think, and this has been partly the purpose of my book, to show that they can be relevant once again within the context of debates on secularism, the role of religion in modernity, and so on. And so I wanted to give you a bit of an idea of who these people I'm working on are, because I suspect that probably not all of you would be familiar with them, because they're not necessarily mainstream figures, though some of them are, as I'm sure you'll realize. So can we show, no, I can deal with that. I'm not very good with technical things, but let me see. Oh. Where am I supposed to point this thing? Oh. Okay. So basically, my interest over several years has focused on a movement within Russian religious philosophy, which is called in Russian "Syedinstvo," which I've translated as full unity. Now, the beginnings of this movement go back to the 19th century with the Slavophile thinkers in the first half of the 19th century, Kireevsky, Khomyakov, and so on. But the really big and important figure within this movement, the thinker who really set, in a way, all the big questions that the whole movement would engage with, was Vladimir Solovyov at the end of the 19th century. And this is him over there. I think he's quite an interesting figure on several levels, and I think I'll be mentioning some of the ideas that have to do with his philosophy. Now, can we move to the next slide? Now, this is a painting in the Tretyakov Gallery, and it shows my man, so the person I'm working on, Pavel Florensky. He's the one in the white cassock. You know, he may not be very sexy, but he made up by being super brilliant. So he was someone who was educated in mathematics and physics. He was a member of the world famous, at the time, Moscow School of Mathematics. Then he moved to theology. He became a priest. And once the Bolsheviks came to power, he was one of the people among his circle who weren't exiled. And the reason for that was that they realized that he could be useful as he started working on scientifically applied projects. He wrote a textbook on electricity and so on and so forth. But one of the things he was doing on the 1920s, which makes him interesting to me, is that he wrote what looks at first glance like art history, art historical texts, but I see these texts as part of his religious philosophy. And this is why my book is actually called Visual Thought in Russian Religious Philosophy, Pavel Florensky's Theory of the Icon. Now, I'll show you the book like that. I think it looks impressive like that. Not so impressive, I'm afraid, like that. It's really small. Now, in any case, the reason I'm interested in Florensky is that he is a representative of this movement of Syedinstvo. So he actually tackles all the questions that are typical of the movement. But he stands out among the rest because he very often conceptualizes these religious philosophical ideas through visual categories. So he talks about perspective exactly in the sense of organizing space in the icon. The symbol exactly in terms of the visual symbol. Icon, image, and so on. But this is not in order to advance knowledge in the history of art. It is a way of conceptualizing philosophical ideas. And I will come back to this a little bit later to show why I think that this was a particularly useful and constructive way about describing the main ideas within the full unity movement. Now, the person that Florensky is shown with is someone quite interesting for future developments within this movement, and in a way the afterlife of the Vsejedinstvo philosophy. Now, this over here is Sergei Bulgakov. Bulgakov actually started as a Marxist thinker. He actually wrote a book on Marxist economy at the beginning of the 20th century. And it is because of people like him, and there were several of the really important representatives of this movement in religious philosophy who came with a background in Marxism. And I think that this is not by accident. I think that there must be a reason why it was so easy to actually go from one movement to the other. Now, what makes Bulgakov also important within the movement is that he immigrated. He was sort of kicked out, and he went to Paris, and he became part of a school of theology in Paris. And the school of theology was actually quite important. This is something which is very little known and almost not studied. I think it is an interesting thing, though, that the philosophy of full unity went into and was one of the sources of the Second Vatican Council, and it came through French translations. So it was basically people like Bulgakov who became quite well known among Catholic theologians in Paris, and their ideas in a French translation were then used, and Bulgakov specifically was quoted several times within these proceedings. So anyhow, these are some of the main people. You may not be familiar that much with all of those, but someone that everybody knows is Dostoevsky. Now, Dostoevsky was very close personally and intellectually to Solovyov. He was very well known as going to the university and sitting at Solovyov's lectures and so on. And a lot of the ideas of the full movement unity come out and were actually popularized by Dostoevsky. I think that it would be true to say that there's one level at which you cannot properly understand Dostoevsky's novels without being familiar with these ideas that come through this religious strand of philosophy. Now, so these are the people, some of the main people within the movement. Now, what was the motivation of coming out with this philosophy? The main idea was that just like many others at the beginning of the 20th century, the Russians also felt that they were experiencing, living through a crisis of modernity. Now, their explanation of what was the cause of this crisis of modernity is a very typical Eastern Orthodox Christian interpretation of the modern situation. Basically, they said that it is because of the false contradictions that had been established by Western philosophy that the Western world was in a state of crisis. These contradictions were very much what they see as the false oppositions of Kant's philosophy, but generally of the whole Enlightenment movement. First and foremost, the opposition between faith and reason, religious and secular reason. The opposition between immanent and transcendent, man and God, subject and object in the process of knowledge, and so on and so forth. And for example, you see how I thought it was a nice way of describing that. Kirievsky, already at the very beginning of, well, no, more like the middle of the 19th century, wrote an essay that was tellingly called On the Nature of European Culture and Its Relationship to Russian Culture. And he basically says that Western culture and Western philosophy can be symbolized by the twin towers of a Gothic cathedral. It is based on oppositions. and it basically disconnects reason from all the other faculties of the human spirit. And so you have all these people coming out of this movement, engaging with what they saw as a real problem lying at the heart of Western modernity, and they came up with the idea that they would come up with a project where they would offer an alternative philosophy to the mainstream of Western philosophy. And this is why they called it Всеединство, so full unity or all unity. So in a way, probably something which would be, can I just see something? I don't want to take too much time. Oh, okay. So I think that this is probably familiar, again, through some of the writings of Dostoevsky. You know, when there's this very famous speech, the Pushkin speech by Dostoevsky, where he talks about the Russian man being a все человек, a complete man, and how the role and the mission of Russia was to, let me just quote, I don't think you can do better than Dostoevsky, so, you know, that there was a universal and all unifying Russian soul, which would bring an ultimate reconciliation to Europe's contradictions. So all these ideas that, of course, you can see are very utopian ideas, they go to the heart of a movement that was quite well established by the end of the 19th century, that actually tackles, you know, the problems of Western philosophy and wants to come up with its own alternative project. Now, as I mentioned, I believe that this movement was ultimately utopian. I don't think that they really achieved the aim that they had set to themselves. They didn't come up with a convincing philosophical alternative to the Western Enlightenment tradition. Now, the reason, however, I find this philosophy is interesting is because I believe that they did something which is quite important. In a way, they opened Christianity to modernity. And I think the way they did that was because it was the nature of the project to actually unify faith and reason, which meant that the understanding of religion, of the whole tradition, was that it was a modern project of religion that naturally embraced aspects of modernity and secularity. So this is why you see a lot of these figures within this movement, and Florensky probably is stands out among all the others, writing about religion by going to theories of mathematics, talking about physics and so on. Because for people like that, there was no contradiction between secular modern ideas and religion, because their way of seeing religion embraced by its very definition these other aspects. And I think that this can be used in several ways, which I think can be quite constructive in contemporary discussions on secularism. And I'm going to suggest two different ways in which these ideas can be developed. For example, I think that some of the most interesting notions within modern philosophy, from my perspective, have to do with secularization theories that look at the religious origins of secular modern ideas that we usually tend to think of as coming out of the Enlightenment. Now, there are people like Charles Taylor, one of the permanent fellows here at the Institute, and he's written a lot on that. And people connected to this trend of philosophy have written in recent years quite a lot about how ideas like democracy, human rights, the dignity of the individual, and so on, instead of looking at them as coming out of the Enlightenment tradition, have a much longer trajectory going back to the late Middle Ages and so on. Now, all these discussions, which I think are quite interesting, focus mainly almost exclusively on Western material. Nobody has really engaged in a serious way with the Russian tradition that was looking very much at these same ideas, starting from these same questions. So I think that there are several ways in which this philosophy can be used nowadays in discussions and debates, especially around secularism, the role of religion in a secularized modernity. Now, I just wanted to show you something which I think illustrates this in a more concrete way, this understanding of the concept of full unity and how it worked in practice. Can we move to my last picture? Okay, now, as I said, with a lot of these figures within the full unity philosophy, the main bone of contention was with Kant, whom they saw as the worst representative of the mainstream of philosophy. And this is why it is not surprising that someone like Florensky paid a lot of attention to, for example, the opposition that Kant draws in his aesthetics between subject and object, that you have a viewing subject who is looking at perceiving the world, or in very concrete terms, the way you look at a painting. Now, for Florensky, the way you look at an icon disturbs this whole epistemological model, because when you look at an icon, you believe that, as Florensky says, she herself is in her icon. So you are in the presence of the Virgin. You are in the presence of the saint who's depicted. You are in the presence of Christ. And in this sense, the whole relationship between subject and object becomes different, because in a way, the object stares out of the picture. So, you know, I don't want to go any more into icons. I think what I'm going to finish with is that one of the reasons that I think that the whole project of full unity sounds much more ambivalent now than it did at the beginning of the 20th century, where it was mainly seen in very positive terms, is that, of course, we've lived through the whole experiment of these totalitarian projects. So we see things in a very different way. For the people I was working on, full unity was the best thing that happened, you know. But then, you know, we see how these ideas worked in politics as well. And I think that this is why nowadays we are much more suspicious and cautious when we deal with such holistic conceptions of history. So, yeah, that's it. Now, Gail can go. Well, thank you. Gail has much more juicy and exciting personalities than my people with the cassocks and so on.
Do I hold this one as well? No. There you go. Come on, actually take that one back. So we decided when we were sort of coming up with this, trying to find a joint theme, one of the things that particularly struck me was the idea of utopias. Obviously, the Russian Revolution is one of the ultimate utopias. And a utopia that goes very, very badly wrong and turns into one of the biggest dystopias you could imagine. So that was the reason for that. If we can go on to the next slide, thank you. So this is my book that's coming out. It's about, let me tell you what it's about. It looks at the internal disagreements which have become known as sort of internal oppositions within the Bolshevik Party, and I look at them from 1916 to 1921. So when the discussions, disagreements, debates, I mean, the Bolsheviks were a very argumentative party. And all those disagreements and debates were suddenly squashed in 1921 with what became almost like a diktat produced, which is called on-party unity. On-party unity, it was put through at the 10th Party Congress in 1921. What is it? It sounds quite harmless, really, doesn't it? What it actually means is that once the decision has been made in the Central Committee, no more discussion is allowed. It means you don't sit there and disagree amongst it, as they had been all the time. Bukharin, for example, strongly disagreed with Lenin's decision to make peace with the Germans. Amongst the decisions being made by Trotsky in the Red Army were hugely controversial and produced about 4 or 5 different platforms on that one. And then finally, you got what was basically the whole decision about what to do with the trade unions, which became known as the workers' opposition. Because the Bolsheviks, as it turned out, had a real problem with the workers. And not just the workers, but they had a real problem with the competition provided by the trade union. So the response to this was to clamp down on that discussion. At the time, it was argued that this was a very necessary step to enforce discipline. Discipline, why? Because in 1921, you've got peasant uprisings going on down in the south of Russia and in western Siberia. You've had the Kronstadt sailors, the Kronstadt fleet, in mutiny, which at just the beginning of the Congress, and people actually left, delegates left the Congress, went to Petersburg, and then actually they went across the ice, and there was a battle on the ice, basically, to take on the Kronstadt fleet. As the conditions were such that the Kronstadt fleet, who had been one of the biggest supporters of the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, now turned against the revolution. So it was seen that now was the time to crack down. Now is not the time to have your committees and discuss these ideas and have disagreements. Now it's discipline that's required. And it was argued this is a necessary temporary step. But like so many things that came from the Civil War period, temporary turned into permanent. And so this became the way the party ran its business. Now, with the resolution on party unity, what is interesting is now how the language changes. Because all disagreements and disputes, which were given all different kinds of names, like raznoglasia and all this kind of ideas, sort of differences of opinion, now got one name. It's called opposition. So from within your own party, you get opposition. Not disagreement, not disputes, not arguments, opposition. And with this, the whole game changed. So the previous disputes of 1919 to 1921, so was, as I said, regarding the place of the military in relation to the party, that became known as the military opposition. Wasn't at the time, but then becomes known as the military opposition. Then the place of the unions in relation to the party. So all these other institutions or parts of society that in some ways present competition to what became known as the Communist Party and its rule of government, all now become known as opposition. So my book traces how these internal debate was squashed and then eventually banned. Now, of course, it takes much longer than 1921 to do that, but I look at this particular period, and that's what I'm going to come on to, because as when Clemena and I were trying to find a common theme, I could see that utopia and unity were clear features of the movements of the time, in both revolutionary and in a religious sense. And then if we go to utopia, I sat there thinking to myself, where does this utopia idea come from? And I saw it, I thought, it seems to be very much amongst the historiography of sort of Western historians, when we look at the early interpretation of the opposition platforms within the Bolshevik Party, in its first days and its first years. Like I say, I go back to 1916, before the revolution. And it's seen as a utopian movement within the party, these opposition movements, trying to get the party back to its glory days, trying to take the party back to its original, more collegial orientation. This kind of glorified idea of what the party was before 1921. or before 1917 even. And it's always portrayed, for example, in the likes of Robert Daniels's work, The Conscience of the Revolution. It was a valiant attempt to maintain the true ideology of the golden age, but it was also a fruitless struggle against an increasingly authoritarian trend that was Lenin's government. Now, for the Bolsheviks, this utopia was very short-lived. And the unity, if you look it up, unity, jedinstvo, means that basically you bring together differing strands and you reconcile them. You reconcile differing ideas and approaches. But for the Bolsheviks, the end of this utopia with on-party unity doesn't mean that you reconcile differing ideas. What unity now means for the Bolsheviks is discipline. It meant not breaking ranks. It meant unquestioning loyalty once that decision was made up top. It meant secrecy for discussions. And its antonym becomes opposition. Splitters, factionalists. So I started thinking to myself, why does Western historiography always take this idea of this kind of golden age, this utopia, which I don't necessarily see amongst Russian historians? I could be wrong, please contradict me on that one. But Western historiographers also see this, these early sort of movements, early disagreements within the party, as the forerunners to the struggle that goes on between Trotsky and Stalin in the 1920s. This view tends to portray Trotsky as the inheritor. It can be Bukharin as well, but Trotsky as the inheritor of the ideologically pure strand of Bolshevism. Stalin is the heir to the corrupted policies of Lenin. So that's the utopia. That's Trotsky, later Bukharin, are the ousted leaders of what should have been the promised utopia. Now, as I say, the main protagonists of this school, you usually come across these ones, Robert Daniels, Leonard Shapiro, etc., from that sort of Cold War period. And so it doesn't seem to matter whether you're left or right or whatever. It's the view can either represent their own desires for the revolution, I suspect, rather than a realistic interpretation of these inter-party disagreements. A desire to have a potentially much better outcome than, of course, what actually really happened. It's well known, of course, that Cohen's book on Bukharin was much thumbed by Gorbachev, a belief that somehow there was a way of getting somewhere it went wrong. And historians pretty much spend a lot of their time sitting there trying to figure out and put their finger on where it went wrong. I suppose I'm joining in now as well, basically saying, well, actually, it was never right. Really. So I'm not putting my finger on a time. It strikes me it was never probably right. So moving on to the next slide, please. Now, I have somebody a lot sexier, I have to say, than Pavel Florensky. I was considering why did they have this idea? And it strikes me that a lot of Western historians have kind of followed a line that's been set by the way, that's not Leon Trotsky. That's a new Netflix series. Actually, it was first on Channel 1 in Russia. And this was sort of what made me think about. It's not as trivial as it looks, by the way. It's a very serious matter. So this series on Channel 1 presents Trotsky. It's a new series. So in 1917 to 2017, 100 years of the Russian Revolution. Russian government didn't do a great deal about it. It was much commented upon. They actually didn't know, obviously they don't quite know what to do about it. Revolutions aren't exactly hot at the moment. It's not a hot subject. Empire is the hot subject. And it's difficult. Obviously it's part of your history. It created the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union after 1945 is what you're pretty much founding your new legacy upon. It's a tricky one to deal with. But Channel 1 came up with this. Trotsky. I mean, it doesn't get, I mean, sexy, he was everything. It was like Trotsky, the rock star years. You see him hanging out of his train, you know, etc. Women were just throwing themselves at him. I mean, who wouldn't have been a revolutionary in those days, quite frankly? And there he is, he just runs around in his train having love affairs all over the place. It's amazing. I mean, the Russian Civil War looks fantastic. Never mind the 10 million dead, but there we are. So I was thinking to myself, what is strange? Because it struck me, this is so weird. How odd that they do this. And then I suddenly thought, actually, what's weird in a way is I started thinking about the influence that Trotsky has had upon the Western historiographical view of the revolution in a way that it hasn't had, of course, in Russia. In Russia, the image of Trotsky is very different than that in the West. So little was known of him and his writings in the Soviet Union. When he was allowed back in the 1990s, there was very little interest in alternative communisms or alternative utopias. Who cared? And this recent portrayal of Trotsky in Channel 1's miniseries shows him as this sexy revolutionary, like sort of Lord Byron, like mad, bad and dangerous to know. There he is, off on his train again. And like I say, it was a very, very odd thing because it was almost, to me, it was almost sacrilegious. It's like, you know, how could you trivialize this? This is the possible potential of the revolution. But the point is, he's far from being a sacred icon of the left in Russia. And this shows in the few works that appeared on Trotsky by Russian historians. For them, he's another revolutionary. And he'll be ranked pretty much along with Lenin and Stalin and whatever. He's nothing special. And so what I think is, too long, the historiography of Western specialists has been influenced by his writings. And I think the point is that probably, whether it's their political inclinations or actually just his skill as a writer and putting a story across, and his obviously very charismatic character, as Bruce Lockhart, who was a diplomat at the time, and you knew Trotsky in Russia, he was a diplomat, come intelligence, come journalist, and whatever, who I think gives a very good sort of description of Trotsky. And this is what you get across Trotsky. He's very arrogant when you sort of, I've been obviously working in the archives. He's incredibly arrogant. Lots of people cannot stand him in the party. And Bruce Lockhart described him as a man who would willingly die fighting for Russia, provided there was a big enough audience to see him do it. And I think that's very, you know, this is Trotsky's charismatic sort of figure comes across, and it looms very large across the Russian Revolution, and then, of course, what happens afterwards. So basically, there's that sort of thinking on Trotsky, which works on the early party. I then found that they emphasize the movement for some kind of supposed intra-party democracy, revolutionary ideals, which were just undermined completely by Stalin, by one person. For Trotsky, his chronology breaks down into the golden age, the heroic period of the Civil War, when, of course, he led the Red Army to victory. And then everything goes badly wrong pretty much after 1923. Lenin starts to disappear off the scene. And can we go on to the next slide there? So this is his idea. This is 1919. You can see that basically Bukharin there with his head down. You've got Zinoviev, Rykov, and of course Stalin. They're all mates. They weren't really. Actually, Stalin and Trotsky couldn't stand each other. But this is still the early years. They're all sitting there, they're discussing, they're chatting and whatever. They're actually not, by the way. But this is the image we have. That this was the early golden days before it went wrong. And there's Trotsky leading the troops out, etc., about to take on another front. So if we can go on to the next one. Now, Trotsky's view is that it all goes wrong in 23. So first off, sorry, it's a bit obscured at the top, but for Trotsky, the Lenin levy, they let any old peasant, shopkeeper, anybody in. The Lenin levy was set up to sort of like to open up the party. The gates of the party, always carefully guarded, were now thrown wide open. The political aim of this manoeuvre was to dissolve in the revolutionary vanguard in raw human material. So you don't choose your revolutionaries anymore. You're not choosing these people. They're not genuine revolutionaries. They're just any old rubbish that you allowed in, without experience, independence, and yet with the old habit of submitting to the authorities. And that was the problem, as far as he's concerned. The other problem, of course, was the fact that he wasn't there anymore. Are you keeping an eye on the time for me? Okay. And then, of course, the other thing was Stalin. One person. Well, actually not one person, because it's Kamenev and Zinoviev as well. And they all form together, and it's a huge conspiracy against him. And it's they take the control of the rank and file, they take control of the party machine from the rank and file members. That's the problem. So that's Trotsky's view of what happens to his utopia. But even a cursory look at the changes and the conflicts within the party in these early years of the revolutionary government shows that his claim was completely disingenuous. His schedule of events are extremely subjective. I mean, it's notable, of course, that when he starts having problems, that's when it all goes horribly wrong. There's no question of the extent to which Stalin clamped down on the party from the late 20s. But I think the claim that it was Stalin with Zinoviev and Kamenev who started this really does have to be challenged. This was something that had long been going on in the party. So, as I say, he puts it down to the Lenin levy. Well, when I looked at the party recruitment from 1919, what you see is that from between 1919 and 1921, there's barely a worker, well, there's hardly any workers in the party by then. They've been completely swamped. And who have they been swamped by? They've been swamped by peasants who were conscripted into the Red Army and then can jump straight in and jump straight into party membership. So these people, I mean, because one of the problems in the Civil War is how can you guarantee loyalty? There is no loyalty in the Civil War. So the one way that it felt you could do it was by taking on people who had fought for the party. Now that was nice when you had a Red Army that were volunteers, trade union volunteers who had gone out, joined a militia, and then went straight off to the front. That's nice, that's great, you can guarantee their loyalty. But what's forgotten is that you couldn't get those volunteers. You simply couldn't get the numbers. So what actually happens with the Red Army, and there's always a cognitive dissonance about this. Trotsky keeps giving his theses on the military, where he talks about the sort of the militias that are going to be formed and they'll be based around factories and workers and whatever. The reality was that you more often than not ended up having to have front recruitments, which means that you literally recruit the peasants from the front, and then if you keep going forward, they disappear. So what you actually have is you have a large peasant army fighting for you. Both sides had it. That's all you can get in Russia. And so as I see, the 1919 to 1921, when you look at the people who are, first of all, joining the party, and then the delegates that come along to the party congresses, by 1921, you have pretty much anybody who's been to a previous congress is very much in the minority. The majority of the delegates at the 1921 Congress are people who've never been to a Congress before. Now Trotsky blames it all on 1923 onwards and the Lenin levy. In actual fact, Trotsky was partly to blame for all of this. He was there while all of it was going on. He ran the Red Army, he recruited the peasants, he went on and then basically encouraged the recruitment of these peasants then on into the party. So in the conditions of civil war, loyalty was a quality highly prized. As a result of that, you end up in a situation where the party is manned almost completely, not almost completely, but largely by people who've come in as Red Army men. As we see with by the crime comes the crisis of 1921, it's this membership that overwhelmingly supported the suppression of internal disagreements. It's this membership that overwhelmingly votes for the suppression of discussion in the resolution on party unity. So it was the loyalty of these soldiers recruited into the party in 1919 and 1920 that throughout the party ensured a very firm support for this decision. It's not some conspiracy. This was done by the party membership. Another part of maintaining the idea the Civil War is a heroic period is his portrayal of Stalin in this period. If we can go on to the next one. He portrays, so Trotsky's portrayal of Stalin, and even Isaac Deutscher, who is basically, of course, Trotsky's most famous biographer, that he portrays Stalin too much as villain ex machina, and he views him still as he had viewed him years earlier, as too insignificant to be his antagonist, let alone to dominate the stage of the Soviet state and of international communism for full 3 decades. You know, it's like it was all those sort of slurs about Stalin from in the early years, about Comrade Paperclip, the Great Grey Blur, whatever. All those ones have sort of lived on in the historiography that we have. And then suddenly he appears out of nowhere, somewhere in about 1924, as if he wasn't there before. There's obviously new biographies coming out now that are giving much more about Stalin's earlier life. The reality was Stalin was a linchpin of the whole revolutionary movement, as I go into the archives. And also what comes across is not only is Trotsky being disingenuous when he puts this across, I think in actual fact, he's doing it for his own purposes, whether it's his ego or whatever. But as I went through Trotsky's papers, he's dealing continuously with Stalin. Everything, so much he's doing, Stalin sent here, Stalin sent there, he's a troubleshooter in the Civil War. He's also insubordinate. Let's have a look there, to give me an example. So the documents in the archive from late 18 to early 20, Trotsky is having to deal a lot with Stalin's postings, his appointments, his general uses to go down with food supply brigades, etc., down south to get grain off the peasants and whatever. So it's actually, is it disingenuous, or in actual fact, is it Trotsky reinventing? I mean, obviously Stalin's idea of himself in what became Stalingrad, I always forget the name of it, Volgograd, etc., the Red Verdun and all this business. But that's not really been what's left in the histories here. Stalin's always ignored in the early point. So it's clear when you go through the archives that Stalin already, by 1919, with the military opposition, had set himself up in opposition to Trotsky. This is not something that just happens in the 1920s. Long before he joined in with Zinoviev and Kamenev. In the chapter that I have in the book on the military opposition, I outlined the first really serious conflict between these two men. And from the correspondence in the archives, it's clear that from 1919 onwards, Stalin, in order to avoid direct contact with Trotsky, always spoke directly with Lenin. So Stalin goes on to make decisions that are actually military decisions, but basically then directs them to Lenin. And Lenin, in a way to try and keep these two men on side, literally sort of just passes them on to Trotsky. And then when Trotsky replies directly to Stalin, which of course Stalin doesn't take any notice of, Trotsky then has to go back via Lenin. So that's how it's being done. So it's been done either by Lenin or via Sverdlov. Sverdlov comes in on a couple of occasions to actually try and manipulate the situation somewhat. So, as I say, the transcripts of these direct conversations and telegrams are redirected by Lenin to both of the men. So Trotsky's later dismissal of Stalin as merely second or third fiddle just doesn't accord with what in actual fact was going on. And it didn't accord, of course, famously with Lenin's own view of Stalin and Trotsky as the two outstanding leaders of the present Central Committee. an opinion that he propounded in his final letters to the 12th Party Congress, known also as kind of partly as Lenin's Testament, in which he warned of the dangers of a split between these two men. So the letters are well known amongst historians of the period, and yet still somehow this idea of Stalin's role in that period as insignificant sort of continues. So to round it up quickly, it wasn't a single idea or individual that brought about the bureaucratic degradation of the party that Trotsky pointed to. Instead, it was a gradual process, and it was initially predicated on the desire to ensure loyalty to the party in the conditions of civil war. By the time of Lenin's death, this was all already in place. The revolutionary utopia had not been betrayed. It had simply formed into a military style of party hierarchy. And under the banner of party unity arose a particular type of loyalty, an extremely hierarchical discipline, and this was openly called initially civil war discipline. The membership, high and low, bought into this because it initially sorted out chaos. And the membership including Trotsky. And so despite his later attacks upon the bureaucratism and authoritarianism of the party under Stalin, Trotsky himself had played a significant part in creating that scenario. Have I got a couple more minutes? Or am I finished?
What you say?
2 minutes, okay. Okay, so the evolution of the party in the Civil War into the leading institution of government set in motion a series of changes, which eventually resulted in the acceptance of this motion on party unity. And at this time, the semantic meaning of the word hardened into one word. It was opposition. So once the party saw enemies in its own membership, this is when all debate and dissent started to take on a more sinister hue, as we know. That's well known. And facilitated the future direction it would take under Stalin. And this is why I think we have to rejig the timeline regarding the revolution. The Civil War years were not the golden age of the revolution. They're not any heroic period. The utopian strand in the party's debates were in a minority. Time after time, as the democratic centralists kept coming back, they just keep being kicked out of the room. Nice idea. Nobody's got time for this. And the new membership overwhelmingly supported the new line and applauded the imposition of discipline. And finally, paradise was not lost when Trotsky was dubbed an oppositionist and gradually driven out of Eden. He was as integral a part of this formation as Stalin. So, okay, thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Jan Sova. I'm a sociologist. I'm a visiting fellow here at the IWM. I have some questions to both of our great speakers regarding religious thinkers in early 20th century Russia and the secular, post-secular question. I have to say, I am a little bit skeptical about post-secularism, not only because living in Poland, you maybe see the question from a different perspective, where actually the problem is not secularization, the problem is exposed role of religion and religious institutions in public life. However, on more intellectual level, I think, because it somehow all goes back to this Carl Schmitt idea that political concepts are actually theological concepts that are transferred into the zone of politics. When you look at Western Christianity, I think this thesis is very problematic because it's very easy to show that most, if not all, theological concepts are taken from outside of theology and are made into theological concepts, right? When you go into St. Thomas or Augustine, it all somehow goes back to earlier philosophy that was not at all theological. It was just very handy for them to do theological concepts out of philosophy that was not theological. My question is, how does it relate to Eastern Christianity? Because honestly, I know nothing about how theology developed in Eastern Christianity. The schism was early enough, 1052, yes, if I'm correct. So that was early enough for this reabsorption of antiquity in Western philosophy didn't happen. So my question is precisely how this concept developed in Eastern Christianity. Would this criticism also apply to Eastern Christianity? And a small question on modernity. What exactly was the concept of modernity among those protagonists of your book and of your project? Because modernity is an extremely ambivalent phenomenon, right? You have colonialism, obviously, is part of modernity. However, gender equality and emancipation is also part of modernity. Racism and slavery is part of modernity. Capitalism would not come into existence without Atlantic slave trade and all that it implied. On the other hand, universal civil rights are also part of modernity, and civic equality is also part of modernity. So I think people who criticize modernity quite often criticize us in the name of ideals that are also part of modernity. So how those philosophers, those thinkers, how did they understand modernity? And a very quick question regarding 1921, because actually the 10th Congress, also something else happened that you didn't mention, which was new economic policy. You have this famous speech by Lenin where he's talking about commanding heights, right? So we keep control of the commanding heights. The rest, it may be bourgeois capitalism. We do not care so much. It may be even handy in a way. You would think that you hear a Menshevik talking, not a Bolshevik. I think it was deeply reactionary. Do you think that there maybe was a link between these developments in the field of economy and how they saw internal party discussions and the general reactionary turn, the way I understood your interpretation of what this Congress actually implied and what it did? Sorry for very long questions, but both talks were detailed and very rich, so this is why the questions are also like this.
Thank you. Thanks very much, both. That's really terrific and plunging us back into many areas that some of us looked at when we were studying and doing other things. Two areas. One is there seems to be this space in between that I don't know whether either of you have looked at, and that's the whole role of art and the way that both art, the Maleviches of this world and the Dziga-Vertovs of this world had a role in both promoting the revolution, partly, of course, believing in the utopia and helping build kind of this image and this myth that was happening. And of course we know how all that ends, but a reflection on that. And more a question to Gail, how much did you look at those who very early on caught on to the fact that, for example, like Alexander Berkman, writes his journal from 1920 to 22, the Bolshevik myth, and sort of sees everything that's happening, or Boris Suvarin or Victor Serge, who are really the ones who actually suddenly, even though early on believing in the utopia and wanting to make it a better world, become disillusioned and reveal onto those who, not many I guess, who are reading this stuff, what was actually happening.
Okay, thank you. I don't mind. Do you want to answer the gentleman's question on Eastern Christianity, as I get a bit stuck?
I thought that these were great questions. Now, I think there's several things about, for example, when you said about Eastern Orthodox Christianity and how it's similar or different to, Protestantism, Catholicism, and all that. I think that what is interesting here is that while in Latin Christianity you have the Renaissance, you have the Enlightenment, in the whole Russian tradition you don't have these ruptures. And I think in this sense it is different because there is a continuity through the whole process, and there is no sense that you're fighting back against something unless it is fighting back against the West, because within your own tradition, you didn't have these big secularization moments. Now, and this is why, by the way, I find it ironical that having in mind this continuity within the Eastern Orthodox and then the Russian religious tradition that grows out of it, and that very much identifies with it, that in these secularization debates nowadays, the Eastern Orthodox and the Russian tradition is not mentioned at all, because actually there is a very long, uninterrupted tradition of actually dealing with these questions in a different way that it's done in the West, but it is always there. And I think it is something to think about also in connection to your other questions with modernity, for example. Now, I don't want to get muddled up with various terms and so on, but I think that there is a certain sense in which it would be true to describe this Russian religious project as, in one way, anti-modern, in another way, postmodern, and actually having points of contact with contemporary discussions. It is anti-modern the way it positions itself, because all these people, what they really have a problem with is not just Kant and Kant's philosophy, but the whole Enlightenment project of modernity. When they talk about modernity, and when they say that modernity is in crisis because religion has been forgotten and so on, what they really mean is that there is a problem with the Enlightenment project of modernity. So they actually mean something very concrete. And because they start from there, the answer to that is the problem of the Enlightenment project are these false oppositions between religion, modernity, and so on, and we'll come up with a project that brings them together and shows how religion works within modernity. Now, you can then ask me, what did they mean under a project of religious modernity? I think that this is where this utopian moment comes across, because I think that they couldn't really come with a very convincing project of that. But I see that, that's why I see it as a project. It's not, unlike with the communists, it's not something that was really tested. I think it is a project with interesting ideas here and there that need to be pulled in, reconstructed, and I think they can be useful and interesting. So, why do I think that this project also has elements which are postmodern? Because I think that the critique of the Russians, of the Enlightenment project of modernity, in many ways sounds similar to ideas that we find in postmodern philosophy. And this, by the way, ties in with Ivan's question, because this is nowhere as obvious as in ideas on aesthetics and on art. You know, for example, one of the things that I found quite interesting when I was reading Florensky's writings on the philosophy of art and aesthetics and so on, is that very often he even uses words that sound very similar to the late Heidegger's writings on art. And it's not because there was any influence or anything like that. It's because they actually see a lot of the problems with the modern project of aesthetics, the mainstream project, which was, by the way, the mainstream project at least until the 1960s. And they see the problems with this project in very similar ways. So this is why they use terminology which is actually very similar. So, yeah. Now let me see what else I wanted to say. Now about, your question about the role of art. I think it is quite an interesting question, because I think we mainly think in those period as, on one level, it is the time of the birth of the avant-garde. And of course the avant-garde was so important, you know, as a lot of the most interesting experiments actually came exactly in the Soviet period. What I find interesting about the Russian avant-garde in particular is how up to a moment they strongly identified themselves with Western avant-garde movements from which they actually derive. They talk about themselves as Cubists, Futurists, and so on. And these were all people who had studied in the West. Some of them knew Picasso, had trained with various big Western artists, and so on. From one point onwards, you see these people actually trying to, in a way, cancel out and delete this connection to Western modernist movements. And they start talking about themselves as being uniquely Russian, coming out from an authentic Russian tradition. And this is where the icon becomes important, because, of course, if you're going to come up with this story, and I think from an art historical point of view, it is a story, it's not true. The Russian avant-garde is part of a European avant-garde. But this is not the story that they told about themselves from one point onwards. And this is why the icon becomes so important, because the whole idea of their authenticity, Russian genealogy and all that, works only when they pull in the icon and they show how they grow out of the icon. For example, one of the really interesting avant-garde artists, Natalia Goncharova, whom I like a lot, she talked about herself as a cubist, a futurist. At one point onwards, she says that she has nothing to do with these movements. She's a purely Russian artist, and I'm not European at all. This is the conclusion she draws. You know, it's a story. It's a way of inventing a tradition, really. So, Gail, would you?
Okay.
Oh, you have that. Oh, you're dealing much better with this thing than
Okay. It's just attached. Right. So, regarding NEP as reactionary, yes, absolutely, of course it was. But as I say, going back to, I mean, in some ways, they talk about all these things. It's a planned economy. It is something modern in that respect. But if you look at NEP, it was something that was almost waiting to happen. Because if you go back through the Congresses, all you see is time after time, although of course this is very little, again, not really particularly dealt with so much in some more general histories, is you go back in the Congress, every single Congress, there's a section that's called the agricultural section, the agricultural question. And the real question is, what on earth do we do with the peasants? Time after time after time. And then the point is, they have absolutely no clue about the peasantry. And they don't really know quite how to fit them into their policies either. So they start off with, so they have this theory, of course, which was stolen straight from the socialist revolutionaries, their sort of classifications of the peasantry. And so their supporters, of course, are going to be the poor peasants, the bedniaks. That goes so horribly wrong. They can't get any grain in the end of it out of the peasantry, because this is really what it's about. They can't get any food stuff to actually supply the Red Army. So they have to go back and have a reclassification again, and have to have another rethink. By 1919, bedniaks go out. They're still our friends, of course, and our supporters, but now we're going to make friends with the middle peasants. And so there's that new policy now, which then comes through. By the time it gets to 1921, the reality is it's any peasant. It's absolutely any peasant. And let's see what we can get out of them. And so there might be the policy, there might be the theory. The fact is they reclassify them according to exactly what they require. Is it reactionary? It could be reactionary, yes. But as I say, there's always, as you're going through the speeches, there's always a strong sense of a huge cognitive dissonance between this theory that's going on and then the reality of which, of course, they're having to deal with on the ground, which is in actual fact you have to supply a very large army. And how on earth are you going to do it? And then, of course, at the same time, you've got people starving. Cholera is coming through. Typhus is coming through. How do we sort this out? And so, yes, it is reactionary. But at the same time, it becomes a big policy. Regarding art, I think Clemena answered pretty much. Regarding the other writers, of course, Boris Souvarin, Victor Serge, etc., I mean, of course they do. In actual fact, I was initially triggered to start looking at this years ago when it was my former supervisor at Cambridge, whose father, her name is Anna Balafia, her father's name's a Menshevik, who completely escapes me now. And we were talking one day, and she was talking about her father, and she was saying that what was most shocking, not father, grandfather, sorry. What was most shocking, what he said was most shocking, was how quickly the Bolsheviks had turned. There's a sense that somehow or other that people were allowed to stay around for a long time. It was actually the socialist revolutionaries that got everybody into trouble. No. How quickly they turned, and how quickly they started making everybody into an opposition. And so that's obviously been on my mind for a long time. And I suppose that, yes, those other writers, of course, do tell you about that as well. There's a lot of literature out there that will tell you about this. It just always struck me that I mean, I suppose there hasn't been much, I shouldn't say that, but sort of the turn in history has sort of gone rather against writing political histories anyway. So there's probably not really been many people who've been digging in archives or looking at congresses for quite a while. But it's just struck me that there's still this idea that there's kind of sort of stuck back somewhere in the Cold War, that somehow there was this, it all went wrong in about 1924. And when you look, you think, no, it's seriously wrong from much earlier on. Yeah.
Okay, another round of questions.
Is there a micro? Thank you. Let's say I was maybe misled by the title of these presentations because I expected to some extent that we would not hear completely two disjoint presentations, but something about the relationship between religion and revolution in those years, how they interacted. To my knowledge, it is very clear that religion was harshly and in a bloody way persecuted. There's no doubt about it. The question is maybe, a little question, was there a difference between Trotsky and Stalin concerning the religion and persecution of religion? Maybe this is one concrete question. The second point is that when you mentioned some religious thinkers, you didn't mention some of them who are maybe even more important, like Berdyaev, Ilyin, and so on, and who have been changing their positions during their lifetime, sometimes from Marxism to mysticism and so on. And they were sent out, to my knowledge, also by the philosophy ship, and they ended up in Paris, so they had a very good, let's say, end, because many others have been killed. Now, why I'm asking this question? Because these thinkers have become extremely topical recently after the pact between Putin's dictatorship and Russian Orthodox Church. Of course, we cannot go, I don't expect to get an answer about the relationship between Russian Orthodox Church and the government during the last 100 years, although it would be very interesting. But I'm asking the question, because the chief ideologist of Putin's Russia today is a philosopher Dugin, who is all the time and again referring exactly to Berdyaev, to Ilyin, and so on. So maybe you could just make some remarks about how this relationship developed during time, and especially what was the relationship during the golden age of the revolution, for which I would like to have also an explanation. What and why golden? Thank you.
Okay.
The first, the most strongest communist party was the Russian party in the 20s. The second strongest was the German Communist Party. Do you have worked on that, the differences and all that? Because they have no orthodox background. They have a Protestant Don't they? They have you have a German Protestant background. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I'll address your questions. Now, the first was a critical comment, and I have nothing to say about that. I'm sorry if you were disappointed. I'm just saying that your first comment was more like a comment than a question, and I have nothing to say about that. I'm sorry you were disappointed in your expectations. Now, for your second question, I'm fully aware that in the West, probably the best known Russian religious philosopher is Berdyaev. But Berdyaev was not part of the Vsedinstvo movement. He actually was quite strongly opposed to them for various reasons. He did write in very interesting ways about representatives of this movement, but he himself was not part of the movement. This is one of the reasons I haven't paid any attention to him. On the other hand, he's interesting for me because he also has this Marxist background. He also started in being interested in Marxism. He wrote several texts on Marxism, and then he became a religious philosopher. As I said, he's outside this movement. Now, what I think is, though, something I find very interesting about your question here, like when you make connections to Putin and the Orthodox Church nowadays. One of the things that I was struck by when I started working on this topic is that all the ideas that I found really interesting within Russian religious philosophy come from outside the channels of the official church and are very often strongly opposed by the church. All these people I'm talking about, like Bulgakov, whom you saw, he was almost excommunicated by the Russian Orthodox Church, Florensky himself is an interesting example because he was a priest. He never really was in open opposition to the church, but he could have been because he wrote on certain issues that the church in Russia had declared heretical. So the thing is that all the ideas that I find interesting and which I think can be used in various new and constructive ways nowadays come from outside the channels of the official church, and very often the church was and still is strongly opposed to these ideas. And I think in this sense it is no surprise that probably the writer who did the most to put Christianity on the map at the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, Tolstoy was excommunicated by the church. So in this sense, I don't see the tradition of the Russian church as being intellectually interesting for my purposes. What actually strikes me is to what an extent they hold these very conservative positions, intellectually not interesting in any way, and to what an extent they're completely actually outside this ideas that are religious philosophical ideas that I'm dealing with. And I think it's a shame for the Russian Orthodox Church at the beginning of the 20th century, and I think the same now. I don't think that any of the interesting, exciting, intellectual, religiously valuable ideas come within the Russian Orthodox Church. This might change at some point, but right now I find the situation very unpromising. So, and the fact that Putin cites Berdyaev or Ilyin and all that, obviously we know why he cites them, but I think that he also intentionally misunderstands them or takes out only certain aspects of these philosophers and uses them in completely different ways without really getting to Berdyaev is an extremely interesting thinker. So, yeah. So, but thank you about the questions.
Oh, no, I don't need that, Clemena. Oh, yeah. So, this actually reminds me, whenever Clemena and I have discussions, there's the two very different approaches we take. So Clemena sits there saying, well, no, this is a very interesting thinker, this, and he's just taken it in the wrong way and taken it that. And I just sit and think, but he would, wouldn't he? Because he would. So the fact is that Putin, of course, uses Ilyin. He uses whatever. So did Stalin. Stalin brought the church out, wheeled the patriarch out, etc., when required. But he would, wouldn't he? I mean, in reality, I think if you start looking, I mean, think about it. I came out of the metro from the Lenin Library. I turned the corner, I was going towards the Clemena, I was going to cross over the bridge, and I saw, I can't remember how big it is. How many feet is it? It's about 20, I don't know, it was huge, 20 odd feet. Our statue of, who? Vladimir of Kiev, of course. Fortunately of Kiev, but never mind, there you go. Another new symbol of Russia. And this was basically, what, 2014? He would, wouldn't he? Who knows what he thinks of them or whatever. They're very, very useful thinkers. And you pick and select as you want. Stalin brought the patriarch out. The church has turned up to be very useful over the years. I mean, if you think about it, I was just thinking, if you look at sort of persecution, then they come back again, then persecution again. I mean, if you go through the century, you find Lenin, of course, persecuted them. Stalin a bit, but then actually brought them back again. Khrushchev, of course, immediately turned back on them again. And then now, of course, you've got Putin. They were wheeled out again after Yeltsin. I mean, everybody had their own pet Orthodox priest walking around with them, it seemed to be the case. And now Putin's very big on that. It seems to be a sort of a cyclical thing, it strikes me, when you start looking at it through the history. I don't know, I haven't got much to comment. I'm not an expert upon sort of religion at all.
The difference, complete difference between Trotsky and Stalin concerning persecution of the church, was there any difference?
Stalin probably, well, I mean, Trotsky didn't bother at it so much. It was Lenin who was much more against it. Stalin, as you say, yes, Stalin, of course, he's a Marxist. I mean, what, basically being brought up in the seminary, was it necessarily interesting? I don't know. I would say more that it's the usefulness of the church. You can persecute whatever, but Stalin is much more you bring them out when they're useful. You'll dig them out of any prison or whatever, and you bring them out again, and you give them tea on the terrace of the Kremlin. I mean, that's my own sort of rather cynical view of it, but it strikes me it's probably quite close to the truth. Now, the other golden age, heroic period. I mean, it's pretty much whatever you want to call it. It's really why golden age. It's what is seen when it's looked back, when you go in all the sort of the memoirs from the 20s onwards, they're already saying by 25, it's gone downhill already. You know, so it's more that period was looked upon by what we call the old Bolsheviks, people who were in before 1917, look back on that period as the real struggle. It's what they came, everything that was going to be was possible in that period. By 21, it's gone. By the end of the Civil War, the whole thing is gone. And that's sort of, so when you get a lot of those memoirs from that period of the 1920s, which, you know, obviously I've been reading quite a few of them, that's what comes across in the party itself. The heroic period when all was possible, in theory. You had a question regarding the Russian Communist Party and the German Communist Party, which I've already...
20s.
Oh, in the 20s?
In the 20s. Have you done work?
No.
No, you either.
Well, no, I haven't done any work on the German Communist Party. I imagine it was quite important as they were expecting the revolution.
But you were asking about in relation to the backgrounds they were coming from?
How it turned out, how it worked out.
Oh, I see.
Because the one is the Pravoslav church, and the other is Protestants. Not very much to do. Enlightenment, all that, but nevertheless, the second Communist Party.
I must admit, I wouldn't like to comment on that with not knowing enough about the German Communist Party in the 20s. I don't know, I mean, I'd be a bit concerned with ending up in Weber territory and started talking about work ethic, so.
All right, I'm afraid we're out of time, so let's give a round of